Welcome to the Tipping Point Show. I'm Jimmy Evans. Thanks for joining me today. I have a very special guest, one of our most popular guests, Bill Salus, and he has written a new book called The Future War Prophesies that we're going to be talking about. You're going to want to hear that. Before we get to Bill, let me just say we have our prophecy conference coming up on September the 16th at Fellowship Church right here in Grapevine, Texas. We have a killer lineup of speakers that day. It's going to be a fabulous conference. Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, I believe he's the most profound prophetic voice in the world today. He's not just going to be there and be there speaking, he's also going to be blowing the shofar and having a special service for Rosh Hashanah. September 16th is Rosh Hashanah. We're praying that Jesus comes during the conference. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And so we're going to get together, we're going to encourage each other, hear some great teaching. Dr. Tony Evans, one of the greatest teachers in the world today, is going to be there teaching on Bible prophecy. We have Pastor Ed Young, Dr. Mark Hitchcock, Billy Crone. We also have coming all the way from Russia, Rick Renner. Rick is a fantastic Bible teacher, one of the best Bible teachers in the world today. He's going to be a part of our panel. We're going to have a Q&A panel answering questions real time from the conference there. I'll be bringing a couple of special messages there. The Lord put something on my heart that I want to share at the conference. I think it's going to really bless you. But I guarantee you one thing, you're going to leave encouraged. You're going to leave with a better understanding of what's happening in the world right now. September 16th. And by the way, if you're a paid subscriber to endtimes.com, you get a 50% discount. And so we also have the live stream. And so it's $49 for the live stream. If you're a paid subscriber, you get a 50% discount off that. We would love to have you be a part of the conference, but it is coming up now very quickly. So you need to sign up right now, endtimes.com. We want to have you be a part of the conference. Well, I'm excited today to have joining me on the show a very popular guest, Bill Salus, is best-selling author and end times expert. Bill is the founder of Prophecy Depot Ministries. He's here with me today to talk about his new book and DVD titled The Future War Prophesies. Bill, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Jimmy, thanks for having me on your program.
It's always great to have you here. You write some fantastic books. Now, this is your new book, The Future War Prophecies. It says Arab-Israeli War, Gog-Magog War, War in Heaven, Armageddon. Now, these are things, people, and I'm always fascinated. Now, you're a scholar, and when you're not on the show, we refer to you a lot. Anytime we have any doubt about something, we always say, well, Bill says this. So related to the wars, I hear so many different opinions on when this war is, things like that. And I know a lot of people have questions about it. So how many future wars are coming?
Well, I've got roughly about 14 inside of the book that I address. We've got the first war of Iran with Elam, the Jeremiah 49 prophecy. We've talked about that on your program before, right, Jimmy.
Yeah.
And then there's the war between Israel and Syria. The Isaiah 17 talks about the destruction of Damascus, but actually Isaiah 17 in conjunction with Jeremiah chapter 49, 23 through 27, actually speaks about a full-set war with Syria. And so I get into that as well. And there's a proxy war I believe that we can also find in Isaiah 17, probably including Iran's proxies of Hezbollah to the north. Syria, of course, is a proxy. Hamas, the Houthis, and even some Shiite militias in Iraq, the Hamas in Gaza, etc. And then I believe, and I sort of sequence these as I'm telling you right here. I believe this will be the sequence and order of events, but of course I could be off a little bit. Then I believe the Psalm 83, final Arab-Israeli conflict, would then happen. Then Ezekiel 38, the Gog and Magog war. Then you get into the seal judgments. You got the wars of the white horseman, the Antichrist, the fiery red horseman, the second horse of the apocalypse, probably world wars, holy wars with the pale horseman, the fourth horseman of the apocalypse. Then you get into the trumpet judgments, the fifth and sixth trumpets. The fifth trumpet, it talks about a locust invasion, which torments all the mankind for 5 months. And I believe those are demonic. That's a demonic invasion. I put forward the arguments for that in the book. Then we have the sixth trumpet war that kills 1/3 of mankind, the 200 million man army, which I also believe is demonic as well. Then we get into the war in heaven in the mid part of the tribulation. We get into God's wrath gets poured out in the bowl judgments during the tribulation. Then at the end of the tribulation, you have the final battle at Armageddon, the Armageddon campaign, if you will. And then you think, well, the wars are over for the millennium, but then after the end of the millennium, the second war of Gog and Magog happens when Satan gets loosed out of the bottomless pit. So there's a whole lot of important information covered in this. We're looking, Jimmy, in the near future of the coming of a war-torn world is what's going to happen here.
It's just, you do such a good job of the sequencing of this and your rationale. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail related to Iran and Syria and some of those kind of wars. I want to go back for just a minute. Now, the war in Iran, the war of Elam that you first mentioned in Jeremiah 49, now this is when Elam experiences, southern Iran experiences some kind of a disaster so huge that it says that the people of Elam are scattered literally around the world, and that Elam is uninhabited. And so you think, you were talking about sequencing, you think that's next?
I really do, and I think that would trigger the proxies of Iran to go against Israel. We just mentioned who they were a moment ago. I believe at that point Israel is in a massive war against Syria, and in the midst of that war, Damascus gets destroyed. Other major Syrian cities get desolated by the children of Israel. We're told in Isaiah 17, verse 9, and then the destruction of Damascus appears to happen overnight. It says in Isaiah 17, verses 14, one night you see him speaking of Damascus in the masculine pronoun, but in the morning he is no more. It sounds like they get probably a nuclear weapon takes them out. But I do believe what triggers that is the Elam War.
Well, they practiced, the Israelis last year, their chariots of fire, military exercise between all of their branches of military. They practiced bombing Iran and then immediately protecting their own borders. So they know exactly what's coming. And I agree with you, Bill. I think that the Elam War will be the beginning of all of these conflicts. Now, so you believe that as soon as Elam is destroyed, that the Israelis will go after Syria is the next thing?
Yeah, it's difficult to know which comes first. Is it the destruction of Damascus and the strong war between Israel and Syria? Or is it Elam, the prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39? Is it that war that triggers the Syrian war with Israel? But I do believe after both those wars, the Arab world will be in an uproar because they'll see Damascus get destroyed by the Israeli Defense Forces. And that's a major Arab city. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city. Goes back about 4,000 years to the time of Abraham. And I believe the Arab states will be in an uproar because a couple things happen. Not only is Israel going to take out a major Arab city, but also we're told in Isaiah 17, 4 through 6, that Israel takes a severe shaking, a hit. And I believe what happens is that's why Israel has to take out Damascus, because they're in a prison rules war. Yeah. And we're told in those verses, and I get into them in depth inside of the book, that Israel takes this severe hit. And so now Israel's wounded, if you will, and they've taken out and desolated a lot of cities. They've destroyed Damascus, and the Arab world is thinking to themselves, well, what about Beirut in Lebanon? What about Amman, the capital of Jordan? What about Cairo, the capital of Egypt? What about Mecca down in Saudi Arabia? And Israel's hurt right now. Why don't we come against them? And I believe that would be the actual fulfillment, the final fulfillment of the Psalm 83 war.
So the Psalm 83 war is, and we've talked about this before, but I want to talk about it again. Now, a lot of people believe that the War of Independence, that the Israelis fought 1948 through 1951, that was the fulfillment of Psalm 83. And one of the last times you were on the show, you talked about this. Why don't you agree with that? Why do you believe that this is still unfulfilled?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but let me tell your viewers as well that inside of this book, more so than any of my other books, I explain why Psalm 83:1 was not historically fulfilled. I provide historical sources of that information, why it's more than just a prayer, but it's also a future war prophecy. But I also get into many historical sources about why the Elam prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49 has not found fulfillment, or the destruction of Damascus has not found historical fulfillment. So I have a lot of information as to why I believe all of those are future wars. One of the problems with thinking that it was fulfilled in 1948, which, I mean, all those nations in Psalm 83, they form an inner circle of countries around Israel, they all did come to war in 1948 with Israel, plus a couple more got involved as well. But the thing with Psalm 83 maybe that would have been, you would have thought that might have fulfilled the first 8 verses where it talks about the motive. They want to come together as a confederacy. They want to cut the nation of Israel off. But verses 6 through 8 tell us who they are and their ancient names. And inside the book, I put their modern day equivalents on who they are today. But we go on, and the rest of the book, there's 18 chapters. The next 10 chapters talk about the Asaph is petitioning God. Asaph wrote the psalm. Destroy them so that they will be confounded and perish, like the chaff before the wheat, etc. And he uses examples of how God stepped in the book of Judges with Gideon to help him win over the Midianites, and with Deborah, the prophetess of Israel at that time, to win over the Canaanites. And when those wars happened, and I get into those accounts inside the book, the Midianites nor the Canaanites ever oppressed the Jews again, and that's not the case right now. We're looking at a situation where Psalm 83 happens. The Israeli Defense Forces will decisively defeat their enemies around them, and they will never oppress Israel again.
See, you said that, and I wanted everybody to hear that explanation, because that's what changed my mind. Because for a long time, I would just tell people, well, I think Psalm 83 has already been fulfilled. But the enemy ceased to exist after the Psalm 83 war. And so that makes a lot of sense. Now, the Gog and Magog war, and there is a lot of conjecture about the timing of the Gog-Magog war. What I agree with you, Bill, when you say the Gog and Magog war basically ushers in the tribulation. It ushers in the covenant with the Antichrist. Do you believe that?
Yeah, I do believe that the Gog and Magog war in Ezekiel 38 happens concludes just before the tribulation. I think at least 3.5 years before, because they'll be converting weapons from the enemies of Russia, Iran, Turkey, and all that coalition of Ezekiel 38. They'll be converting those weapons into fuel for 7 years. So, at the midpoint of the tribulation, the Jews are going to be fleeing for their life because the Antichrist is going to try to commit genocide of the Jews. So they won't necessarily be converting the weapons to fuel. If anything, they'll grab a weapon to defend themselves on the way out of Israel into where the remnant will ultimately be in Petra, Jordan. And I also pinpoint why that's the case inside the book as well. So, but I don't think Ezekiel 38 is quite ready to happen yet, because Israel has to be dwelling securely, without walls, bars, nor gates, living in the midst of the land, full of plunder and great booty, because that's, of course, what Russia's motive is. They're coming for great plunder and booty. So I think after the wars we just talked about, Jeremiah 49, Elam, destruction of Damascus, Isaiah 17, Psalm 83, Israel can dwell securely and take down the walls they've got on the borders and the partition wall running through the heart of Israel. And then at that point, I think, is when Ezekiel 38 is primed to happen.
Right. So what are the future war prophecies concerning Iran? Now, Iran is just, off the charts aggressive. Their rhetoric toward Israel is they have vowed to destroy Israel. They're amassing on the northern border of Israel. I think Israel took out the Aleppo airport this week. They continue to bomb Syria on a regular basis because Iran is trying to build a fortress there. What are the future war prophecies concerning Iran?
Iran has a double jeopardy in the end times. They're the subject of dual prophecies. We talked briefly about the one in Elam. By the way, on a map of Iran, ancient Elam hugged the Persian Gulf. It was sort of in central west, on the west coast of Iran. And then the other portion was Persia, the other rest of Iran, which is the majority of Iran, really. But Ezekiel wrote about Persia in Ezekiel 38, verses 5, about a decade or two later than Jeremiah 49 was written, which was around 596 BC. Jeremiah wrote that prophecy. And both those prophecies talk about in the latter days. They use the same terms. So they both are end times prophecies. So Elam is going to, I think, happen first. I think that's going to lead to the war with Israel and Syria, the proxy war, then leads, after Israel wins those wars, takes out those proxies. I believe Psalm 83 would happen. Israel wins that war. The Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Inside the book, I show all the places they come on the scene for the purposes of defeating their enemies, because they're not fighting in the tribulation period, because in the first half of the tribulation, Israel's living in a pseudo-peace. They think they're safe. They built their temple. They're doing worshiping going on inside of Jerusalem at the temple. But at the midpoint of the tribulation, the Antichrist goes in and does an abomination of desolation, sets up his image there. And then in the second half of the tribulation, they're fleeing for their lives. Even Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel in the holy place, the temple, the third Jewish temple, then flee immediately, because he knows, according to Zechariah 13:8, that the Antichrist is going to attempt a genocidal campaign against the Jewish people, in which 2/3 of the Jews, we're told, will actually be killed.
Yeah, it's horrific. Now, the Lord supernaturally, in the Psalm 83 war, and also in the Gog and Magog war now, so there is a supernatural intervention by God, is that correct?
Yeah, it's very interesting that those two wars, which I think are both pre-tribulation wars, God intervenes. Of course, we know that he intervenes in Ezekiel 38. That offensive with Russia, Turkey, Iran, probably would also include Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, maybe Morocco, maybe even Germany. That's roughly about 2.5 million troops that was to happen today coming against Israel, which is about the size of New Jersey presently, and has 176,000 ready troops and reservists and things like that. So God has to stop that. And he does. We're told in Ezekiel 38, verses 9 through 13, that there's going to be a great earthquake that's going to panic the soldiers who are speaking different languages. They'll be coming down from the uttermost parts of the north upon the mountains of Israel. Every man's sword will be against his brother, we're told, when that great earthquake shakes them. Then there'll be pestilence and bloodshed and flooding rain and great hailstones and fire and brimstone. I mean, it's going to be clear, Jimmy, and I'm not sure we'll be here. I think the church may be raptured prior, but I can't say that for sure. But it's going to be clear to everybody who's watching that, and the world will be watching that was the God of the Jews that stopped that. But a lot of people don't necessarily realize that before that, I think God puts his hand in the war of Psalm 83, because we're told in Zechariah 12, verses 4, 5, and 6. Let me find that real quick for you. We're told that in that day when Jerusalem, it says in Zechariah 12:2, it talks about, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling to all the Arab nations round about when they attempt to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem. And I think that's what they'll be trying to do in the Psalm 83 scenario. But he goes on to say that in that day, when Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling to those nations, he says, I will strike every horse with confusion and its riders with madness. I will open my eyes on the house of Judah and will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. And how I lay that out inside of the book is that the first thing that happens is that there'll be malfunctions, equipment malfunctions and things like that. This happened when the Jews were trying to cross the Red Sea back in Exodus chapter 14. And let me just read that for your listeners. It came to pass in the morning. Now God intervenes to stop the Egyptians from taking out the Jews, the Hebrews at the Red Sea. And it came to pass in the morning, watch the Lord look down upon the army of Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud. And he troubled the Egyptian army. And here's what he did. He took off their chariot wheels, so they drove with them with great difficulty. And at that time, the Egyptians, when they saw that, said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Now, that's what I believe is going to happen in the Psalm 83 thing. He's going to start with the confusion on the horses. There'll be malfunctions, just like the chariots of Egypt, they were malfunctioning. Then it says, I will strike the madness, put madness upon the riders, meaning the troops, the soldiers, they're going to panic. Just like that happened in the war with the Midianites, where Gideon's 300-man army destroyed the whole 120,000 Midianite army. And then it says, I will strike the horses with blindness, meaning now all of a sudden the radar and guidance systems are going to be shut down. And we're told in Zechariah 12, verse 5, that's going to bring confidence into the Israeli Defense Forces. When they see their God leveling the playing field, if you will, they're going to get confident. And we're told in Zechariah 12, verses 6, that then the Israeli Defense Forces go forward and says, in that day when Jerusalem is a cup of trembling, and God has intervened with the madness and the confusion and things, it says, in that day I will make the governors, or the IDF, if you read it, the captains of Israel, like a fire pan in the woodpile, which will represent the battlefield being like a fire pan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour the surrounding peoples, not the world at large, but the surrounding Arab peoples, on the right hand and on the left hand. But Jerusalem shall again be inhabited, again in her own place, Jerusalem. So the point is, the Israeli Defense Forces are going to be lifted up and be instrumental in defending the nation, especially when it comes to the climactic concluding Arab-Israeli conflict in Psalm 83.
And that's the Psalm 83 war.
Correct.
And so talk about the Gog and Magog war for just a minute, kind of a condensed version of the Gog-Magog war.
Right. So we're told in the first 6 verses who's involved. I mentioned some names earlier. Then we're told what their motive is in the verses 7 through 13. They're coming together against Israel that's dwelling securely with vast plunder and booty, and they're coming to capture that plunder and booty. Then from there on, it talks about how God's going to intervene in that day, and it happens in the latter years, in the end times. He's going to intervene, like we talked about, with the earthquake and the flooding, great hailstone, etc. And then we get into in Ezekiel chapter 39, that still continues the first 6 verses about God's supernatural defeat. But here we find the purpose that God is going to do that in Ezekiel 39, verse 7. He says, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. They shall not profane it anymore, and the nation shall know I'm the Holy One in Israel, which requires there to be my people Israel, which are in Israel today, the Jews. And he's the Holy One in Israel, meaning there has to be in Israel. So all attempts in the Ezekiel 38 or Psalm 83 or the Elam prophecy or the war with Syria, they will fail because God has to uphold his holy name in the midst of his people Israel. Now, when he does that, stops that Ezekiel 38 invasion, the world's going to be in awe. Like I said, they'll realize that was the God of the Jews that saved them from that onslaught. And then that's when he will say, make his holy name known. And that proves he's a covenant keeper of the Abrahamic covenant, proves he's a promise keeper to believers in Jesus Christ. And that's why he has to have that war happen. And he's going to put hooks in the jaw of those invaders. They're going to come into Israel, and he's going to stop them in their tracks. And then it goes on to say that they'll be burning the weapons, converting them to fuel for 7 years. And it says they'll be burying the dead for 7 months in a valley that doesn't exist just yet, called the Valley of Hamon-Gog, which I believe will be in the central part of Jordan. It's got to be east of some sea and a place where travelers will be obstructed from passing by, and in a valley. And so I even get into comparing the Jezreel Valley and the Valley of Jehoshaphat versus the Valley of Hamon-Gog inside of the book.
Well, it's fascinating. So we began with 13 different wars that you have listed here, and we're now on number 5, Ezekiel 38. And then you transition into the wars of the white horsemen. So this is now in the tribulation.
Yeah, so as I sequence these things, we talked about Elam, destruction of Damascus, war with Syria, Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38. Many of us would believe the clue is they're converting weapons into fuel for 7 years. So many of us believe that is a pre-tribulation event. And I do believe that would follow after Psalm 83 because Israel can dwell securely without walls, bars, nor gates after they take out the Arab threat. It's been since time immemorial. And by the way, I think the purpose of Psalm 83 is the defeat of those Arab countries around them, and it's going to be devastating for them. I believe it's because God has got to end the ancient Arab hatred. That the 2 words in Hebrew are olam ibah. They show up in Ezekiel 25 and Ezekiel 35, saying that the Arabs have always hated the Jews from time immemorial. Now that hatred never went away during the diaspora when the Jews were out in the nations of the world for 1,878 years, returned to their land in 1948. And only to find out that the Arabs still hate them because that hatred got enveloped in the religion of Islam, which is not like the Jews or the Christians, by the way.
Absolutely. The thing I like about what you've done here, Bill, and again, for all the people listening, the Future War Prophecies, where Bill goes through all of these future wars. I know for me, I'm interested in all the wars, but especially the wars that happen while we're here. And, going up to the Ezekiel 38. But I agree with your timeline here, and like you said, maybe a little bit of stuff off, but the war of Elam, when the Bible says in Ezekiel 38, it says, I'll put hooks in your jaws and drag you down. That's a provocation, is what God is saying there is, this isn't your decision, this is my decision, and I'm going to do something to provoke you. Well, everything is a provocation. The war of Elam is a provocation. When Israel destroys Syria, that provokes them. The Psalm 83 war is a provocation. And so right on down the line. But then when you get into the wars of the white horsemen, so Is this obviously an escalation? Are the wars in the tribulation, are they worse wars than before the tribulation?
I do believe so, because I think the white horseman, the Antichrist, were told in Daniel chapter 11, and we'd say the white horseman is the Antichrist coming onto the scene after the rapture. We find him involved in wars in Daniel chapter 11, and many wars. But then the second horseman, the fiery red horseman, it says a great sword is given to this horseman, and he takes peace from the earth. The whole earth he takes peace from the whole earth during the second horseman, and I believe that's probably world wars. And then you get into the fourth horseman. The third horseman is a black horseman, and you got famines, pestilences, and scarcities, and the types of things you would find after massive wars, world wars. But the fourth horseman talks about a pale horseman. Its riders are death and Hades, side saddles with him, and they have authority or control over a quarter of the population of the earth to kill. It says to kill with multiple means, with a sword, which would normally mean military, with famines and beasts of the earth, etc. So that's going to be terrible too. They got control over a quarter of the earth to kill. Now, some people interpret that as they're going to kill a quarter of the earth. They say maybe 1 billion people at that time. They may kill that many, but I don't think that's really what it says. It says they have authority over a quarter to accomplish their ends, which is to, and we find out that ultimately they're killing Christians, because the fifth seal saints, and they may be killing more than just Christians, but the fifth seal saints show up in the fifth seal, and those are believers, and they're crying out to God, how much longer is this going to go on? And then God responds and says, well, you must be patient a little while longer until your fellow servants and the brethren of the fellow servants who will die like you, actually, their periods have to come. So there'll be 3 Christian killing crusades in the end times. And so God is going to be very active. There'll be wars, and I think they will be much more devastating, probably world wars at that point.
What about so you said the number 10 war, the 6th trumpet war, kills 1/3 of mankind, and you said you believe that's demonic.
I do, because you have, first of all, sporting a 200 million man army, deploying that, getting equipment to where it's supposed to be deployed and things like that, is basically never got no historical precedent. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is the clues that were given is that there's 4 angels going to be, 6th trumpet. There's going to be 4 angels released from the Euphrates. They're going to bring up 200 million man army out from underneath the Euphrates, and their breastplates are fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. They've got heads of lions and mouths that emit fire, smoke, and brimstone, tails that have serpent having heads, and they kill 1/3 of mankind. The reason I like to quote Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who wrote the book called The Footsteps of Messiah, who I cut my teeth on that book, and I think it's a prime book. Everybody who wants to understand Bible prophecy needs to read that. But here's what he says about that invasion. He says because a lot of people think it's the Chinese army. Because once upon a time, Mao Zedong said he could support a 200 million man army, but presently I think China's army is around 2.5 million, maybe 3 million, something like that, not 200 million, and that never really happened. But some think it was China. But here's what Arnold Fruchtenbaum says: a person will be hard pressed to find just one Chinese person who looks like this, let alone 200 million of them. The description given of the army clearly rules out their being human and requires that they be demonic. Furthermore, the means by which the destruction of 1/3 of the world's population is accomplished, fire, smoke, and brimstone, involves the supernatural rather than the natural. So I just don't see 200 million men coming together and going into that war. I think of the descriptions that I read to you in the 6th trumpet judgment clearly point out these are demonic armies.
Well, I agree with that. And it's impractical to think that you could move 200 million people, that far to do that much damage. This book is called The Future War Prophesies by Bill Salus. And Bill, now you've written the Now Prophecies, the Next Prophecies, the Last Prophecies. You have a series of books that this is a part of, and this is also a DVD. And so tell us about the DVD real quick.
Well, the DVD, with all my books, I put together a teaching DVD. It's not the book verbatim. I take high points out of the book, put them on PowerPoint presentations, and we get sometimes B-roll in there, lots of headlines to show how current these things are. So that's the Future Wars Prophecy DVD comes with 2 discs in it. One is the Battle of Ezekiel 38, And the first one message on it is called the Future War Prophecies. And I get into a lot of the things we're talking about, and I put them on a screen with PowerPoint. It's very well produced, so that people can actually, see in a condensed version what the book talks about.
So your website is what?
ProphecyDepot.com, Prophecy Depot like HomeDepot.com, and of course the books and DVDs are all there on our online store.
Can they get your book on Amazon?
We're putting it on Amazon. Kindle's on Amazon right now. All the other books are on Amazon.
Great.
This one should be on Amazon pretty soon.
Well, Bill, thank you for all of your research and for writing your books and producing all of this. It really is a treasure. Bill thinks through things so thoroughly. And if you want to know what's going to be taking place, there's a lot of anxiety in the world right now about what's happening. Well, we know the future. And I believe what this book represents is a very accurate portrayal of some of the major events that are going to be happening in the near future, because the Bible talks about wars and the wars that are going to be happening. And so, Bill, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Jimmy, very much for having me on your program.
You bet. God bless you. Thanks for joining me today on the Tipping Point Show. I'll see you again next time. God bless you. Goodbye.